Welcome everyone. While you are still entering this virtual space, it is my great pleasure to welcome my wonderful panel and also all those participating here from our research group, from the individual offices, but also from other spaces, which is the exciting part in the times of the pandemic, that people can zoom in from so many different locations. Welcome to our roundtable tonight, titled Attacks on Gender Experiences from Diverse Contexts, which is organized as part of the program of the research group here at the ZIF, Global Contestations of Women's and Gender Rights. All of tonight's speakers are fellows of this research group who is here together for 10 months to work on related issues and questions. So we are very grateful to the ZIF, the Center for Interdisciplinary Research here at Bielefeld, to provide the space and opportunity and funding to make this possible. And all my colleagues who support us, the technician in the room, Anna Efremova, and my dear colleagues, also who, especially Birgit Sauer, who co-conceptualized this workshop, and of which the roundtable is sort of the highlight. So just to keep it short and simple, because I want the roundtable participants to speak most of all. So the background of our research group is the observation that women's and gender rights are currently being increasingly questioned and attacked in many places around the globe. And our group aims at bringing into a conversation different experiences and perspectives on this phenomenon in order to discuss also the common patterns and strategies and logics behind these attacks, and also in their relation and entanglement to each other, to different spaces, taking always into account, of course, the local and context-specific particularities. We're also interested in the overarching entanglements with larger structures, such as persistent colonial legacies or logics, economic structures, struggles over hegemony, or religious discourses. On the other hand, the ultimate aim, or one of the aims, is also to promote thinking about how we can build feminist solidarities in the face of these recent attacks, and discuss future common strategies of collaboration and solidarity across differences and also beyond borders, be they national, cultural, religious, racialized, class, or other. So it is now my great pleasure to welcome our roundtable participants. Disclaimer: Brenda Kombo is unfortunately sick, so she cannot participate. I hope in the Q&A, our dear colleagues of the research group can sort of try to, of course, not replace, but fill in some of the aspects and perspectives she would have represented. It's a real pity she cannot be here with us tonight. But our speakers tonight are, first, Livia de Souza Lima, who is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Linguistics and Literary Studies here at the University of Bielefeld and a junior fellow at our research group. She holds an MA in Politics, Economics, and Philosophy from the University of Hamburg and a bachelor in Political Science from the Escola de Sociologia y Política in Brazil, and also studied in Edinburgh for a year. And in her current research project, Livia uses performance as an analytic lens to examine the work of elected Black women representatives at the Rio de Janeiro's Legislative Assembly. Also, she is a co-founder of the Hamburg-based feminist collective Miradas Feministas, which is a group that was built at the university to also seek the integration of activism and academia by employing the idea that Latin American feminist activist strategies are a source of knowledge. So this link between activism and academia and knowledge, also maybe as a tool. So that's an interesting perspective for our discussion. And she's interested in the ways in which gender, race, and class are structures that form political behavior and frame it, and the possible relation between representation and resistance, the limits of inclusion of Black women and the other historically marginalized groups, and theoretically speaking, in the fundamental relation between aesthetic constructions, performances, and politics, and the constructive notion of political representation. So welcome, Livia. Our next speaker is Andrea Petö, who is a professor at the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University in Vienna in Austria, and a Doctor of Science at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. She has written 6 monographs, edited 30 volumes, and her works on gender, politics, Holocaust, and war have been translated into 22 languages. In 2018, Andrea was awarded the All-European Academy's Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values. And in this year, in 2021, she also received an honorary doctorate from Söderborn University in Sweden. Her current main research interests are focusing on intellectual and cultural histories of, or the history of anti-equality movements and parties. And as most of you probably know, she has published broadly and widely on the topic of attacks on women's and gender rights. Also on the panel is our dear colleague Birgit Sauer, who is a professor of political science and a deputy dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Vienna. She's a speaker of the network Gender and Transformation at the Faculty of Social Sciences, and also was a speaker of the research network Gender and Agency, also at the University of Vienna. She was also the member of many big important research projects in the EU, including projects on gender, migration, religion, gender and right-wing populism, on violence against women, and she also has conducted research projects on effective state transformations, or the effective state transformation, which is also a special focus and an expertise Birgit brings in. And it includes comparative gender equality policies, right-wing populism and racism, feminist state theory, on which she has also published a lot, democracy and politics of emotions and affects. So her current main research interests are expressed in her position as being a PI of the project Populism and Media in Austria, of also the international project CURE, Cultures of Rejection, and of MyCreate, Migrant Children and Communities in Transforming Europe, and a member of the international research network GEP, which is short for Gender, Equality, Politics and Practice, and she coordinates there the topic Political Representation of Women. Welcome, Birgit, also. Last but absolutely not least, our dear fellow colleague, Shirin Zubair, who is a professor of English and linguistics at Kinnaird College in Lahore in Pakistan. And before that studied English language and literature at the University of Multan, also in Pakistan. And she holds a master and a PhD in linguistics from Cardiff University in the UK. She has taught, among others, at Bahauddin Zakaria University, sorry, Shirin, if I pronounce that incorrectly, in Pakistan, and completed her postdoctoral research project on Pakistani women's literacies and identity as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Texas in Austin in the US. She taught courses on Pakistani literature, culture, and identity at Lee University and at the Central College in Iowa. And moreover, she held fellowships at the Center for Multilingualism in Society and the Center for Gender at the University of Oslo in Norway, at the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg and the Berlin Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies at the Freie University in Berlin. And her current main research interests focuses on the emergence of women's marches in Pakistan's major cities since 2017 as an indigenized feminist movement, or in these movements, along with the challenging linguistic landscape of Aurat March protests and visuals. So very warm welcome also to Shirin. And with that, I would like to open the first round of questions. And maybe Livia, you want to start with elaborating a little from your perspective and in your context, the context you are most familiar with. What are the main challenges or contestations recently that you could see to women's and gender rights? What are the main actors of contestation, the most contested issues, rights, policy fields? Do you see alliances, particular semantics that are evoked in these discourses? What are the most prominent fields of contestation? Which arenas do you make out? and maybe also which function you ascribe to these phenomena you observe.
So good night, everyone. At first, thank you very much, Julia and Birgit, for organizing this event. And also welcome to the other panelists. I am looking forward to discussions and I'm happy to be here today. So as I am from Brazil myself, I thought of sharing a bit of what I consider to be the critical reflections over this anti-gender crusade in Brazil. What I think is it can be considered some sort of anti-gender crusade has made its entrance in Brazil, specifically using this term of gender ideology in 2003 as an agenda mostly promoted by the Catholic Church. It is though only in 2015 that this term gains prominence in the public debate, mainly in the context of the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, which was actually our first female president, whose process of impediment in 2016 was a laboratory where the anti-gender ideas became then central in creating and consolidating the effective atmosphere of Bolsonaro's government and political agenda. This emergence is important because it functioned as a symbolic glue that aggregated different actors in the extreme right ideological spectrum that have always been present. This is not new, but within this emergence, it sort of organizes the symbolic discursive atmosphere in a single political force. This force found in that context an opportune and propitious moment for a mobilization that aimed to curb the advances of emancipatory movements, especially in the face of gender equality agendas and the legitimate acceptance of sexual diversity and difference. In Bolsonaro's inauguration speech, he has promised to, among other things, value the traditional family structure and oppose gender ideology in order to preserve the country's values. The incorporation of an anti-gender agenda in Bolsonaro's government goes way beyond his sexist and chauvinist declarations that maybe some of you might know, which can also not be ignored. But further than that, this discursive choices are also incorporated in his government strategy. The discursive frame of gender equality is considered as a menace to the traditional family constellation and as part of an international Marxist and communist conspiracy. This political direction is deeply harmful because at the same time it fosters this effective atmosphere of opposition to the civilizing advances promoted in the scope of a broad perspective of gender equality and sexual freedoms. It also prevents within the government the creation of effective public policies to promote equality and the right to sexual diversity. Bolsonaro finds support and resonance in this anti-gender crusade, both in Congress, where the evangelical caucus dominates 20% of the total seats, and is an important actor in this field, as well as in society, where he maintains a loyal base of approximately 30% of the Brazilian population, which is also a considerable parcel of society. I consider that this alliance between the government and the fundamentalist evangelical sector has been proven to be particularly harmful for the advancement of an intersectional feminist agenda in the country. One of the best examples of this alliance can be illustrated by the Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights in the person of Damares Alves, which is the minister. She's also a woman herself. She's an emblematic figure for the comprehension of the instrumentalization of gender in Bolsonaro's government, revealing also the influence of the evangelical sector in government. She has a long time trajectory of serving the interests of the evangelical sector in government and been working as a parliamentary assistant for 9 evangelical pastors at the Federal Congress in the past 20 years. She has been the protagonist of apparently innocent statements such as boys wear blue and girls wear pink, to more sinister events. Damares has been investigated for being involved in the actions that attempted to prevent the assisted abortion of a 10-year-old girl who was a victim of sexual violence. This occasion was also emblematic of the work the fundamentalist evangelical sectors have been performing against basic human and reproductive rights. they have gathered in a demonstration in front of the hospital where the procedure would be conducted, with the hope of stopping the girl from having an assisted abortion. So that's how serious and deep it is. Damaris represents the belief that people can find protection and salvation in the church and not in the state. And if the state shall take care of the people, it should be doing so by means of the church. Her personal motivation of saving the children in Brazil resonates in other fields as well, mainly taking into consideration that people, especially the ones in condition of social vulnerability, find in the church the comfort and feeling of protection that is not so easily found in the state, whose presence is not positively felt. One of the latest examples that I would like to present here today that clearly shows how this evangelical thought is pervasive of the political institutions in Brazil can be found in the latest program launched by the ministry. It's a program named as Program Strong Families. And of course, they mean the heteronormative family. It's a program designed to strengthen familiar bonds. It is very similar to the evangelical repertoires of action in relation to family counseling. It promotes family meetings facilitated by members of the public authorities and is aimed at strengthening the processes of protection and family resilience, reducing as such the risk related to behaviors considered problematic or erratic. I shortly introduced this program because I consider that it is an example of how the public sphere, the institutional sphere, is being used as an experimental field of how religious repertoires of action can be incorporated by the state, helping in the promotion of conservative ethics that consolidate the role of women in society, which is a major setback, thinking about the advances that feminism has been able to achieve in the last decades. It also reinforces the idea of the heteronormative family, as it also excludes and invisibilizes other forms of being and existing, and also of being a family in the role in relation to the diversity of gender identities. As such, I believe that this junction between religion and state is one of the most central aspects of anti-genderism in Brazil, and I am looking forward to listen to the other context and to be able to see what are the similarities or differences in this specific case. Thank you.
Thank you, Livia, for this tour de force through the current Brazilian context. You spoke about religion and state. I'm sure that Andrea can relate to that and elaborate a bit on the context she's most familiar with and her experience and the contestations she makes out as most relevant. So the floor is yours, Andrea, Petö.
Thank you very much, Julia and Birgit, for organizing this event. My task is to give a background of Hungary, which became a global leader of the conservative revolution. So Hungary, for the greatest surprise of many, now plays a leading role in the international arena as one of the initiators of international treaties, conferences, redefining human rights, women's rights, and gender rights. This activity of soft power secured for this small, poor Central European country a permanent place in headlines in international media. It also created the illusion that Hungary is a major player in international politics and the leading force behind this, what the Orbán government calls, I quote, new conservative revolution, waged against liberalism, values of 1968, including the sexual freedom and reproductive rights. It is a part of the process of setting symbolic scores with the left liberal politics. Fidesz politicians portray them as the continuity of post-1945 communist Hungary. Analyzing attacks on gender rights, where gender is becoming a symbolic glue, as we defined it with Esther Kovács and Veronika Grzebalska, globally is happening on 3 different levels: transnationally, nationally, and on local level, to redefine rights and reconfiguring a new form of citizenship, which actually leads to localization and making the state redundant. So let's see first the transnational level, then I will go to the local, and then I will finish with the national level. So transnational, I mentioned 3 formations. Hungary initiated several international collaborations and became the supporter, among others, the World Congress of Families, which is a global umbrella organization. The World Congress of Families has already organized 3 so-called demographic summits where the politicians gathered to share strategies on rising birth rates in response to the decreasing and aging population. In October 2020, the Hungarian government, together with 5 other countries, co-sponsored a virtual gathering for signing the Geneva Consensus Declaration on Promoting Women's Health and Strengthening the Family. The declaration was signed by 32 countries immediately. The document stated, I quote, "There is no international right to abortion, nor any international obligation on the part of states to finance or facilitate abortion, consistent with the long-standing international consensus that each nation has the sovereign right to implement programs and activities consistent with their laws and policies." End quote. The signature raises questions whether the Hungarian government plans to introduce restriction in abortion rights, when the number of abortions is steadily declining, and surveys show that it is mainly the poor, underage women who already have multiple children, or women who have got multiple children, see this artificial abortion as one affordable means of birth control, as Social Security does not support any tool of fertility control. The other network is the political network for values, headed by Minister Novak, which is an intergovernmental network, what we have just discussed before this roundtable discussion among us. As far as the local level is concerned, one public hospital in Hungary can declare to be outside the jurisdiction of universal human rights, international treaties, European directives, or even the national law without any real legal or practical consequence to refuse to execute abortions. And that is leading to a new conceptualization of citizenship. The relationship between the state and its citizen has fundamentally changed, and instead of universal access, selective access became the main principle and the way of governance. As far as the policy measures on the national level are concerned, regulations of abortion fit into the wider context of this illiberal family policy. In that field, there are important new developments inside Hungary. Hungary introduced several measures in the family policy with the aim of incentivizing marriage, joint laws tying spouses together, and of encouraging decisions to have children. These are elements of classical leftist redistributive welfare politics. This related family package is called Family Protection Action Plan. And in this framework, in 2019, 7 points program was introduced as I quote, Hungary's response to the demographic decline, end of quote. That contained the following measures: preferential loan to women under 40 for their first marriage, extension of loan programs supporting home purchase, allowing purchase of resale homes, car purchase subsidy for large families, and loan repayment up to 1 million forints of the mortgage loan for families with 2 or more children, lifetime exception from personal income tax for women, raising at least 4 children, pledge, but so far unrealized, to establish 21,000 new creches, places over the 3 years, subsidized parental leave for grandparents, and so on. So this is a social welfare policy in incentivizing consumption and taking up loans. So what is new here? What are the new elements in this program? Is this like a traditional conservative family politics, just getting unusually big government attention and financial support? Where does this policy come from? I argue, as a conclusion, to connect the failed promises of neoliberal modernity or the failed promises of 1989 that opened the door for another political offer, the illiberal offer, which is so attractive to many. The attack on gender rights is implemented on 3 levels, and they are constitutive parts of illiberal politics, as gender serves as symbolic glue, mobilizing otherwise politically very distant political forces with hate and exclusion. Important to stress that this politics contributes to the undeniable political and electoral success of these illiberal parties, first of all in Hungary, because they have consolidated and kept up the popular support with family policy transfer, partly with European Union funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for this insightful sort of perspective on this context, and also for bringing in the different levels and what you consider the new aspects here that I think can be also cross-cutting, or something we should keep in mind for the joint discussion later on. But before that, I would like to ask Shirin Zubair also to join the discussion and tell us a little bit more about her context and how gender is under attack or contested there.
Yes. Thank you very much, Julia and Birgit, for inviting me to be part of your roundtable. I come from the Pakistani context, so I will briefly, I think it is important because it is a very different context from the European context in terms of geographical location, in terms of religion, and the kind of state is an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So I just want to give briefly a historical overview of the feminist movements and women's rights consciousness. It has in Pakistan, this has always been shaped in response to national and global reconfigurations of power, including colonialism, nationalism, dictatorship, democracy, and the global war on terror. The relationship between the women's movement and the Pakistani state has undergone significant shifts from mutual accommodation and a complementary ethos to confrontation and conflict, depending upon the transformation in the nature of the state at particular moments in history. The strategies of the women's movement reflect significant shifts from a focus on education and welfare to legal reform, to women's political, economic rights, and now more recently to women's reproductive rights. A historically consistent and a sustained tension between the women's movement and the state, as well as between the movement and civil society, has resulted from specific articulations of religion at different times, confronted by the impulse towards a secular ethos by the feminist movements. So in terms of rhetoric, when the gender ideology in Pakistan has had a long and checkered history of different types of competing discourses. Firstly, either restricting women's mobility within the private spaces to build an image of ideal Muslim woman, or through promoting the discourse of veils and 4 walls, or allowing them into designated spaces to project a soft image of the enlightened moderation of the Islamic State to the Western powers. So women's identities and rights have been a matter of public and national concern in the Islamic State. These historical trajectories and competing discourses have resulted in and this is Julia Cook, and I quote, construction of an idealized Pakistani woman who becomes available to state leaders and Islamic fundamentalists for ideological purposes. For example, when state and religious leaders restrict women to the confines of the private space through their politico-religious rhetoric, as well as through law, they fashion a Pakistani woman almost exclusively as wife and mother. That wife and mother becomes useful in projects of nation building and Muslim group identity construction, unquote. Women can earn and work outside wearing a veil, but without compromising on their responsibility of providing labor to sustain life within the confines of the home. Therefore, the Veil and Four Walls project has been reconfigured for the 21st century of privatization as well. There is a deliberate ideological purpose behind the state policy which promotes gender segregation by citing deference to culture and tradition as an explanation for women's inability to take part in work outside their homes, have access to social sector services, or have greater political participation. So this the historical state policies and practices of control, regulation, and legislation have crafted a religious and cultural discourse over the years, which has gained pervasive force within the state institutions. And also it has larger social implications. And the social implications of states' religious discourse are far more compelling than the juridical ones. This has led to various groups and collectives to act as enforcers of religious mores. However, these are the most contested arenas have been women's freedom, women's sexual freedom, women's freedom to work, and their reproductive rights. And there's an emphasis on their familial roles and their space being the private space of the family. However, there have been some significant ruptures and shifts in these ideologies and discourses through women's marches since 2018, because they are basically in the year 2021, all these 3 years, the women's marches have been consistently raising the slogan of women's reproductive rights, and they demanded a feminist healthcare manifesto and demanded an increase in budget for women's healthcare. Despite the hue and cry over the slogan as a Western import by the right-wing political parties, the parliamentarians, clergy, or the ulema, media, and some sections of the journalists, and as well as some celebrity writers as well, they have been adamant, and although they face severe resistance from all these actors, this year, the organizers faced tough opposition in the form of disinformation campaigns and accusations of blasphemy and even threats of rape and other kinds of life threats by the banned terrorist group Tehreek-e-Taliban. The main function of these challenges is to curb these challenges and these contestations to women's movements and to their rights, is to curb and control the rising movements on the streets by intimidation and threats to the organizers through false accusations of blasphemy and through threats of rape, and citing religion to influence the mindsets of the masses against the organizers, and even pelting stones at the protesters in these marches to harass them. So there has always been an overt control over the media by the state through the PEMRA, which is a Pakistan Electronic Media Regulatory Authority. It is, although an independent and constitutionally established federal institution, it is usually run by the state actors. It regulates and issues licenses to mass media cultural outlets, including the electronic and print media. It has the jurisdiction to impose restrictions in the interest of religions, security, and integrity of the country. With women's emergence in the public spaces since 2018 with a renewed secular, because the Women's March Collective, they claim to be of secular orientation, and they and they take a Marxist position as well in their manifesto. So there has been, with their emergence, there comes a renewed emphasis on hegemonic control over women's bodies and their physical mobility through stringent legislation, not only through threats, but also through legislation, and other demands for separate universities for women by some actors. Recently, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, in a meeting with media playwrights, instructed them not to write television plays about divorce. He also emphasized publicly that women should dress modestly so as not to invite sexual attacks or rape. So these are some of the contested arenas in terms of gender ideologies in the context of Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirin. That's very insightful also. So now Birgit has the word to speak about, I don't know whether only Austria, but also Austria and I think the neighboring countries, and probably also some cross-cutting phenomena and structures. So Birgit, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I will focus mainly on Austria, as it seems that the Freedom Party of Austria, so the right-wing party of Austria, lost the European race to the right-wing extremist bottom to Hungary. So I think this is an interesting development, because Austria was the first European country with a successful right-wing populist party. Successful meaning gaining a lot of the popular vote. And this was due to a sort of modernization of this party, FPÖ, which comes out of a National Socialist tradition, and which was due to the party's mobilization against migration. So this was the main topic, which then boosted the party since the end of the 1980s and brought them into government 2 times. So, and the central figure of this transformation was Jörg Haider, who some of you might know. So what is interesting is that the Austrian FPÖ, like a lot of other European right-wing parties, only rather late jumped on the anti-gender issue. So the anti-gender issue has been promoted mainly by the Vatican and other religious fundamentalist organizations and the right-wingers. So since mid-1990s, you could say, or already end of the 80s, but the right-wingers jumped on this anti-gender issue rather late at the beginning of the new millennium. And as my colleagues already mentioned, in different countries, this anti-gender mobilization was used to build broad coalitions. And this was also the rationale for the Austrian FPÖ to join this anti-gender movement in the party's aim to struggle for cultural hegemony and for political power. So what is interesting is that Austria is a rather Catholic country. And the Catholic Church has an important role in the social partnership of the Austrian political space. But nevertheless, of course, like also in other countries, the Catholic Church lost a lot of legitimacy and a lot of the members due to the sexual scandals in the church. So, but what is nevertheless interesting is that although the FPÖ tried to promote anti-gender mobilization, the cooperation with Catholic institutions and with the representatives of the Catholic Church in Austria didn't work. This might be due to the fascist past of the FPÖ, which led to anti-clerical and to a very strong secular orientation of the right-wing Freedom Party. But it might also be due to the fact that the Catholic Church was really hesitant to cooperate with the right-wingers, even in the situation where its legitimacy somehow eroded. So the FPÖ was only able to forge alliances with some really conservative Christian Democrats, maybe on the right wing, but the FPÖ was also able to organize a lot of already existing right-wing extremists organization around the party and on this issue of anti-gender mobilization. For instance, the identitarian movement, which is also important in this broad coalition in Austria. So, but nevertheless, the anti-gender mobilization of the Austrian right is, well, you could say, rather moderate. So there is no attack, for instance, on gender studies. There is no open attack on gender mainstreaming or on the acceptance of the marriage, same-sex marriage. There is no open attack on reproductive rights, which I found is a similarity in the countries we already heard about. So this is not the case in Austria, but there is nevertheless, you could say, a discourse about anti-gender, and there has been a rather early book by a prominent FPÖ woman, Barbara Rosenkranz, against gender and against gender ideology, and she, I don't know, she very carefully read and tried to transform Birgit Kelle into the Austrian context. So, and this is one feature which characterizes the FPÖ anti-gender movement, that there is a lot of mimicking of the German context, a lot of copy and paste from the German anti-gender movements. But as I said, there is nevertheless some attacks. For instance, the former leader of the FPÖ, Hans-Christian Strache, once in a speech said, when he will be, or his party will be in government, there will be no such thing as gender mainstreaming. But the party never did anything. So they were not interested in universities. So this was just trying to intimidate perhaps gender researchers. There have been attempts to organize within the parliamentary club of the FPÖ and the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats, to mobilize against the rather liberal abortion law in Austria, but these attempts were not that successful. There are also moderate attempts to organize marches for life, which are against abortion and reproductive rights of women, and but they are really small groups then following these marches of rights for life. There is also support by the right-wing party for so-called fathers' rights movements. So this is rather strong, supporting these fathers' rights, and also supporting these concerned parents who organize against sexual diversity education at schools. So the FPÖ rather tries to organize other organizations which are against gender. What they also try to do is to strengthen the male breadwinner model in Austria by especially transferring money to mothers staying at home with their children. So they somehow try to reestablish this traditional division of labor. And what they do, they always try to ridiculize measurements against sexual violence, against violence against women. So this is something they oppose and they try to ridiculize. But then when they were in government, for instance, there was no big move in taking money, for instance, from these organizations coming from the radical right. It's also more than the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats. And here you can see that there has been a sort of normalization of right-wing and Catholic anti-gender mobilization. So, and this would also be my conclusion, saying, well, how can we explain this rather moderate anti-gender movement? What's the rationale for the FPÖ? And here, when we dive a little bit deeper, is that we can see first that the FPÖ misuses, instrumentalizes gender for their anti-Muslim struggle. And this is the most important issue, how they use gender. And they want to show and to literally always repeat that these Muslims living in the country do not fit to the country. They do not fit to the Austrian culture. And that's why they have either be excluded or even deported. And there are now 3 laws in Austria banning Muslim body covering. And these laws were, of course, not passed by the right-wingers alone, but by a broad coalition, but in parliament, which nevertheless was organized by the right-wingers. So this is one rationale for jumping on gender to promote their anti-Muslim and anti-migrant agenda. The second point I would like to make is that the anti-gender propaganda of the FPÖ is included in their struggle for cultural hegemony. So they want to transform, and I think this is also what Andrea said for the Hungarian case. They want to transform what they perceive as a leftist liberal culture in the country. And they are like other right-wingers in Europe, especially the French one. They draw on Gramsci's notion, who was, of course, no right-winger, but an Italian communist. They jump on his notion of hegemonic struggle as one way to gain political power. And this is the main aim they have. And so they use this gender for their struggle over hegemony. And as I labeled it in some of my work, they focus less to fight feminists, of course they do, and less to fight gender, of course they do. But what the FPÖ focuses is masculinist identity politics. And this is an important part in their struggle over hegemony and in their struggle for political power. So I'll stop here, and looking forward to our joint discussion here on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit, and thank you all. Now I think we got quite some input from diverse contexts, diverse experiences, diverse actors, diverse dimensions, and diverse attacks and contestations on or to women's and gender rights. So I try to bring some order or make things more complex into this. Since all of you have in your little contextualization referred to what you consider sort of the main functions of the challenges that we currently see, maybe we can, in the second step or second round, try to now enter some sort of a conversation by thinking about which aspects or patterns do you consider relatable to other contexts in other countries, but also transnational. Which similar patterns can you observe or not, if you think there's many differences? Yeah, and which maybe transnational corporations are there also? And maybe just to give you some keywords, most of you situated what's happening as influenced by power structures, histories, colonial histories, for example, liberal modernity, post-89 sort of the deception of this promise of liberal modernity, maybe also neoliberal precarization and transformation plays a role, as Livia mentioned, in Brazil, where the state is not strong, but where churches sort of take this place of promising protection at least, and also sort of promote thereby a conservative ethics that I think to different degrees, of course, can be found in all the contexts you refer to. Religion is also a strong argument in the Pakistani case, I think, where also the political sector, and of course also due to the particular institutions and history, this is even stronger in the state cooperate. So where do you see these patterns that maybe we can also try to discuss more in the remainder of this research group? And how is gender utilized, or in which way does it function, as you have already started to elaborate on, for mobilizing very diverse political aims and orchestrate them in the public sphere or in the specific context? Since what I sort of learned from all of your contributions is that gender, I mean, in quotation marks, it might be sexuality, feminism, or the opposition to gender ideology, is somewhat an arena. Andrea has named it symbolic glue. Gabriele Dietze speaks of an effective bridge also for speaking about some of the transformations and issues we currently face. So maybe in a second round now, Shirin can start to think about these patterns a little more in detail.
As I was listening to the input of the other speakers, as well as to the workshop, earlier session in the workshop today, I feel that there are several, I could see at least several similar structures and strategies that are used to in different contexts, but the similarities in terms of how they, for instance, is one of the similarities is that how religion is used in different contexts, and to promote the ideology, the religious ideology of family, particularly with regard to women's roles within the private domain of the home and family. And this has, we saw it was cited in earlier presentations today as well. And then in terms of, and these are promoted through state structures, through institutional structures, not only through institutional structures, but also through the popular rhetoric which is used in the media campaigns or the popular cultural narratives. For instance, now although I come from a very different background, but I saw these similarities, particularly this the family and the family laws in terms of legislation, in terms of the family laws. It has come up in many cases that we heard in earlier today as well. And in terms of for example, the sex education in schools also has come up in the discussions. And I would like to point out here that in Pakistan, for instance, I don't know how people are familiar with these, but although it's a very different context and it's an Islamic republic where, I mean, there is no, sex outside of marriage is considered a crime against the state. So also sex education is a very controversial issue. And since in the recent years, there have been many cases that have been reported of child sexual abuse in the media, and they have been since there are many media channels and the other social media platforms, now they cannot hide, they have been reported. And so there was a lot of discussion and over the media and the public. And so even to this date, I'm not sure, there has been campaigns by the progressive actors in the country where they wanted to introduce some kind of education regarding the sex, regarding bad touch and good touch. But to this date, these are issues that were not even talked about. But I find it was interesting to see similarities that for instance, in the Brazilian case that was earlier presented, and then the commonalities, how the trans people or the transgender people are, marginalized in the Brazilian context, and how they commit perhaps the death rates that was cited. That's very similar, the crime against the transgenders and the way they are marginalized. They've only been taught. These are issues that the women's rights movements are now taking up in the public domain. So I find many similarities. And interestingly, when Birgit was talking about Vienna, and she talked about Austria, she's talking about Austria, and she said that gender is used in the FPO, that they use it as an anti-Muslim tool and as an anti-migrant agenda. It's very interesting. The commonality is that the right-wing actors, the ulema, the religious clergy, they use the gender as an anti-Western tool in the Pakistani case, context. So that I found very commonality. But then there are several other, and also I'm going back to Birgit's point. I find it very interesting, and and I was thinking of presenting, I thought of it, but then I just left it out. When you talk about the masculinist identity construction, so it is very similar that the Pakistani identity in the popular cultural narratives everywhere, constitution, and if we look, I can't go into those details, but the identity is, the nationalist identity is of a masculinist identity, militaristic warriors, national heroes. This is all masculinities that are predominant, and women's roles are within the private, and their sexuality and sexual identities are very much, sexuality is a huge issue, as I said. So I won't take more than that. And also just a little last point is that it is through the commonality is that it is through the politicization. I think this has already been discussed in the previous sessions during the research groups presentations. The politicization and use of religion and religious discourse is across the board in several regions and contexts, including the cases of Hungary and Austria. And although you said that it is moderate, it's not to that extremist level, but nevertheless is very common. And it's been how these discourse, religion is used as a tool and is instrumentalized by the state actors for political purposes. And so I just stop here.
Thanks, Shirin, for trying to cover out some very important commonalities. Livia, can you relate to that, or do you see further ones?
Yes, as I was also listening to the other panelists, it was very interesting to see the similarities, but also some differences can be pointed out. Similarities, I think that Shirin's already said a lot about that. The instrumental use of family, the role of women in society, something that was also present in Andrea Petö's talk about the contested nature of abortion in these cases as well. And one thing that is similar but instrumentally used in another case, Andrea was mentioning of this, how citizenship is also being instrumentalized. And in Brazil, we also have this, this construction of what a good citizen is, but to the point now, I didn't see that this was being instrumentalized for redistribution policies, but maybe that is the next step. And maybe this is something that we should be paying closer attention, because all these policies and the governmental strategies on this point seem to be more culture, seem to be more to boost this conservative ethics and to keep the role of women in society as it is, and to keep this image, this representation of what a family should be also as it is. So this is one point that I think is interesting, because it's similar on one hand, but also different in the other hand in terms of how it is used. And with Shirin's account, which I found very interesting, she was talking about mobility of women and how mobility of women is actually curbed. And in Brazil, it happens in a way that is so culturally entrenched in society, and in the way people relate to this topic, and the way women are treated, and also that the consideration of women in society, that this mobility is not explicitly curbed as in the law, but it has behavioral effects, as every woman in Brazil would consider that their mobility is actually curbed, because if the body of a woman is not respected, if it's considered as a property of the other men, or is something that can be used and touched. And of course, I'm also mentioning about sexual violence, which is very common, or the increase of feminicide, for example, which is a huge problem in Brazil recently. I mean, not recently, but it's recently increasing. So I'm thinking about that. Maybe there is not an institutional effort to curb mobility of women, but when this discussion is not seriously taken in society, if there is no cultural change, then the mobility of women keeps being curbed, which is, I wouldn't say worse, but it's something that is even more difficult to discuss, because it's culturally entrenched. Entrenched, that's a difficult word. And then in Birgit's account, which is maybe something similar with Germany, talking about the existence of a specific political party that that embraces these ideas, like FPO or FDP in Germany. And the interesting case in Brazil is that there is no such a thing. We have 33 parties, and many of them are open to these ideas. And it's really dependent on how well this plays for them. This is like part of this opportunistic kind of politics. And as this idea of women equality, and also the acceptance of sexual diversity, if this is something that can be instrumentalized and used for political purposes, then it would be used, and it doesn't matter if it's a center party. I wouldn't say that the left-wing parties are doing that, but also this discussion is not seriously taken in many cases as seriously as it should. So I will also stop here, but I also think that's very interesting that we see like this cultural aspect and also like the state policies and this governmentality, this government technique of trying to control the women body, but also how this political affiliations also work on and contribute greatly to the maintenance of these structures and to the maintenance of women domination in society.
Thank you, Livia. Andrea, many things have been mentioned. Also the anti-Western function, maybe this or other patterns are something you probably can also tell us much more about.
Thank you very much. I think this kind of patterns are shaping, merging fantastically. I would like to mention two patterns, which I think might help us, those who are in this project, to think further, because you know, obviously we are struggling with the phenomenon how to describe something which is out there. So there is this definitional issue. So I already used this concept of gender as a symbolic glue. I would like to elaborate on this. And the other one, which Livia was mentioning as a crusade, I would like to bring in the concept of Cold War. Maybe this is something which might be useful for us. So are we experiencing a new Cold War between liberal and illiberal forces waged on gender as symbolic glue? I understand gender as a symbolic glue, where gender has been used to mobilize very different political forces to unite hatred for one enemy, like gender studies scholars and practitioners. And Birgit Sauer in her contribution actually pointed out that how the different actors are glued together in this particular fight. It has also become a central rhetorical tool of these efforts to define what pure reason means to a wider audience, to create a new consensus about what is normal and legitimate. And this kind of social mobilization incites hate against what they call gender ideology and political correctness, not only demonizes the worldviews of its opponents and rejects liberal human rights paradigm that has long been the consensus of a European North American consensus. The novelty is that now gender as symbolic glue also provides a livable and desirable alternative that seems realistic, acceptable to many, by focusing on family, nation, religious values, and freedom of speech, concepts often weaponized in the contemporary cultural wars. It is giving a security in an unsecure world. So are we getting closer to a new Cold War waged about different positionality in relation to gender as symbolic glue? Watching news and reading reports about new cleavages created by gender as far as the contestation to gender rights are concerned, we often have this feeling that we have seen that already. When the members of the Bundestag are expected to respond to the proposal by the AfD to stop funding gender studies programs, or in the European Parliament for hours, the members of the European Parliament are explaining the meaning of gender to Prime Minister Orban, that shows that gender became a symbolic and a very real battlefield, also in international politics. The opponents in this debate are gluing together the good, who are for, and the bad ones who are against gender, and vice versa. And this function of uncompromising polarizing is exactly why gender as symbolic glue is so effective. So is the concept Cold War useful at all? Cold War is used as a marker of certain historical period, which meant very different experiences on very different national levels. In Italy, where a strong communist party was fighting with the US-backed Christian Democrats, it was a very different experience than in the part of Europe under Soviet occupation, where opposition was in prison or in exile, or in outside Europe, where proxy wars were waged in the name of the Cold War, where the war was very hot. the concept of Cold War is a conceptual system which has a geopolitical dimension of two blocs fighting for hegemony with their international allies. So gender becomes the signifier of this new political battle. It is a war, but is this cold? The novelty is that this is a civil war inside the country and the war of alliances and international coalitions, as I explained in my previous contribution. What gives us hope is that the Cold War ended with the good ones winning. So this is giving a hope to us all. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Andrea, for this provocative framing of what we see as a new / revived Cold War. Birgit, what do you have to add in terms of common patterns, and redistribution has already been named, effective functions, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, when I was listening to the contributions, I was, of course, thinking what caused these development of struggle against gender or against the feminist movement in Pakistan. And I think we might have a look at the changes in the capitalist accumulation, which took place over the last 30 years, of course, with rather different consequences in different regional and national contexts. But these different forms of capitalist accumulation and work also changed the social reproduction, how social reproduction is organized on national, but also on transnational levels. So the care chains within Europe or care chains in the Americas is only one example for this transformation of social reproduction, meaning of the patriarchal organization of this capitalist way of working and of living. And I think a lot of the issues we have been discussing, mainly the focus on heterosexual family, the denial of reproductive rights to women, but also a sort of demographization of a national discourse. So I don't know, Austrians, Germans dying out, being overpopulated by migrants and things like that. I think this is all can also be read against the background of these changing organizations of patriarchal and capitalist societies. And of course, these transformations also impact on how states are organized and or how democratic governance is organized. And I'm most familiar with the European context, but I think that we can see dramatic shifts between different parties, decline of, for instance, social democratic parties in Europe. So I think this is also an important issue which helped somehow that other institutions and other institutional associations, as for instance, the church became or received a more important role in this organization of the society. And yeah, what I wanted to stress is that one dimension of this change of transformation of social reproduction is also the focus on social inequality. And I think that that also the focus on gender and anti-gender helps to somehow symbolize and symbolize a sort of natural inequality between people, to develop a discourse, who is deserving, who is undeserving, and what is needed. So the social reproduction is, of course, also about transformation of redistribution, of social redistribution. And I think this is all, could all be included in this, what Andrea calls Cold War, saying, well, it's a Cold War. You could also say it's a class war, it's a gendered class war. I think this is also something that if we look at the different countries, we might also be able to see. And I think it's at least what I heard from Livia, it's also the case in Brazil. I'm not sure if it's a case in Pakistan, but I think this is has to be located in differences, regional differences, but anyway, global transformation of the capitalist system. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to you, Birgit, for bringing up these very broad and overarching, but I think very helpful aspects also that are involved in what we're discussing here. And I think this brings us also to the different arenas we're discussing in the frame of this research group, which is sort of the division of labor, the transformation of citizenships, utilization of religion. And I see more and more how these different arenas are entangled and all play into what we try to understand better and also maybe find solutions against after being able to somehow analyze them, maybe. So the gendered class war, the Cold War, some trigger words I hear. I'm wondering also, maybe that's something we can now build into the joint discussion, since time is running, and I would like to include the audience. And we had prepared or thought to also think about possible feminist solidarities, which is the topic of our workshop tomorrow, but in how, maybe just as one idea, in how far some of the things we observe are also connected to maybe not only the failed promise of liberal modernity, as Andrea had it, but also the unfulfilled aspects or unfinished or deceived project of feminism in some way. So I hope you get what I mean in this struggle over hegemony, so that maybe some parts of feminism that have been successful have made coalitions with the wrong bad partners or so on. Just maybe, so, and the feminist and solidarity part, maybe keep in mind, in the back of your minds for the joint discussion, because I now would like to open the floor also to questions from everyone in the chat. Please either raise your blue hand that you find on the participants